The slap landed before anyone in the room understood that the morning had stopped being ordinary. 1 second, the air inside Hannock Table's brand new flagship location was a held breath of camera flashes and clinking glassware, 36 press photographers and food influencers waiting for 9 o'clock, and the unveiling of a cake that had already gone viral twice before it ever left the kitchen. The next second, the sound of an open palm against a man's face cracked through the room like something breaking, and every camera turned toward the same 6 feet of marble floor. Grace Min's hand was still raised. Elijah Carter hadn't moved his feet. His daughter was pressed against his side with both small fists knotted in the fabric of his jacket, and his face, turned half away from the blow, came back around slowly, the way a door swings shut on its own weight, no rush in it at all. That was the moment David stepped out from behind the pastry counter to do his job. He got within 4 feet of Elijah Carter, looked down at the man's forearm where his sleeve had ridden up, saw the old burn scar running in 3 pale lines across the wrist, and stopped walking entirely. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists for. Stick around, and hit subscribe before we go back to the beginning, because nothing about this morning was an accident, and almost none of it was actually about cake. Elijah Carter's Saturday started the same way it had started every Saturday for 3 years, at 4:40 in the morning, in the cab of a refrigerated delivery van, hauling cases of European butter and bread flour to restaurants that didn't know his name and had no reason to. He hadn't chosen the hour. His body had simply stopped negotiating with him about it sometime after Maya died, and 4 years later it still woke him in the dark out of habit rather than necessity. He didn't fight it. He made coffee in a thermos, kissed his sleeping daughter's forehead, and left a note on the counter that said the same thing it said most days: be back by 8. Love you more than yesterday. By 7:45 he was home again, and Helen was already awake at the kitchen table in mismatched socks, waiting for the question she asked every Saturday without exception. Is it cake day? She asked. It's cake day, he said. She allowed herself exactly 1 second of visible delight before sliding off her chair to find her shoes, and Elijah felt the same quiet, wordless gladness he felt every week at exactly this moment, the kind of feeling that had never once needed explaining to anyone but himself. To look at, Elijah Carter was an unremarkable man in the most literal sense. Tall, broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-40s, short gray-flecked hair, a stillness in his face that people sometimes mistook for tiredness. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation and drove a van that belonged to his employer, not to him. If you'd asked anyone in his building what he did for a living, they'd have said delivery driver, and they would not have been wrong, exactly, just incomplete, in a way Elijah had long since stopped bothering to correct. The scars on his wrist and forearm were old enough that most people never noticed them at all. 3 pale ridges where the skin had healed wrong after a kitchen fire 15 years and 1 ocean away, in a city he didn't talk about anymore. He never explained them when people asked, which was rare, because long sleeves cost him nothing and silence cost him even less. What almost nobody in his current life knew, not his neighbors, not his daughter's teacher, not the dispatcher who scheduled his routes, was that Elijah Carter had once been something the pastry world spoke about in the hushed, specific way people reserve for legends who vanished before their time. For 6 years, he had run dessert kitchens in Paris and Seoul that chefs now twice his former salary still tried, and mostly failed, to imitate. He had invented a lamination method for choux pastry that half the patisseries on 2 continents used without ever crediting him, because he had never patented it, never trademarked it, never once tried to put his name on something he'd built mostly out of curiosity and stubbornness in a borrowed kitchen at 2 in the morning. Then Maya got sick, and the calculus of his entire life rearranged itself around one non-negotiable priority, and the pastry world simply stopped being able to find him, because he stopped being interested in being found. By 8:20, he and Helen were walking toward the new Hannock Table location on the corner of Eastlake and 9th, the flagship store that had been teased on every food account in the city for 2 months, the one Helen had been begging to see since she'd watched a 60-second clip of frosting painted to look like moonlight 40 separate times on his phone. Today was the grand opening. Elijah hadn't planned on going on opening day specifically. He generally avoided anywhere with cameras out of long habit, but Helen had asked, in the careful, hopeful way she asked for things she'd already decided mattered to her, and he had never once in 7 years found it in himself to tell her no for a reason she wouldn't understand. Grace Mann had been awake for 31 hours. She did not look it, which was itself the product of considerable effort and a publicist who had arrived at 5 that morning to manage exactly that outcome. She moved through the half-finished dining room in a cream-colored suit, checking sightlines, checking the angle of the morning light against the marble counter, checking the exact placement of a centerpiece that had taken her pastry team 11 days and 4 failed attempts to get right. The centerpiece was called the bride's moon cake, and it was, by any reasonable measure, the single most important object in the building. 6 tiers of ivory fondant hand-painted to look like moonlight on silk, with sugar-spun threads draped between each layer so fine they trembled whenever the front door opened. A preview photo of it had been posted 4 days earlier and had since been saved, shared, and stitched across every platform that mattered to the kind of customer Hanek table needed if it was going to justify the valuation her father's bankers had built the IPO around. Grace's entire morning, arguably the next 18 months of her professional life, had been built around the 4 seconds during which 40 cameras would photograph that cake at exactly 9 o'clock. Her father, Min Tae-sik, who had built the original Hanek table out of a single rented storefront 30 years earlier and had handed his daughter the company on the explicit, repeatedly stated condition that she prove she could run it without softness getting in the way, was watching the livestream from his office across town. He hadn't come in person. He rarely needed to anymore. His presence arrived instead as a single text message that morning, sent at 6:02 a.m., that said only, "Don't embarrass me today." Grace had read it 4 times before putting her phone away. She had spent 11 years trying to be a daughter her father didn't need to send messages like that to, and some part of her, underneath the cream-colored suit and the rehearsed warmth she'd practiced for the cameras, had simply stopped believing it was possible, even as she kept trying. At 8:50, with 10 minutes left before doors opened to press, she was standing 3 feet from the centerpiece, running through her opening remarks one final time, when a small girl in a yellow coat broke away from her father near the entrance and ran straight toward the cake stand to get a closer look at the painted moon. Helen didn't mean any harm by it. She had simply never in her life seen frosting that looked like moonlight before, and the part of her brain that governed impulse control was, like most 7-year-olds, still very much under construction. She reached up on her toes to see the painted detail near the top tier, lost her balance on the smooth marble floor, and grabbed for the nearest stable-looking object, which happened to be the edge of the cake stand itself. What followed took less than 2 seconds and would be replayed, slowed down, zoomed in on, and analyzed from 9 different angles by the internet for the better part of a week. The top 3 tiers tipped first, in a long slow lean that briefly looked almost recoverable, before the whole structure gave way and came down across the marble floor in a spray of fondant and shattered sugar thread. 11 days of work reduced to a wide white wreckage at the exact moment 3 photographers near the door had their lenses up and ready. The room went silent the way rooms do when something expensive and irreplaceable has just visibly ended. Elijah was already moving. He crossed the floor in 3 steps, dropped to one knee beside his daughter, and checked her hands first, then her knees, the way he always did, before anything else registered. Helen looked at the wreckage of the cake, then at the row of cameras now turned toward her, then at her father, and her face did the thing it always did right before tears arrived, a brief, total stillness, like a held breath. "You're okay," Elijah said quietly. "That's the only thing that matters right now. You hear me? You're okay." Then he looked up, and found Grace Mann already standing over both of them. Grace looked at the wreckage on the floor for exactly 2 seconds before she looked at Helen, and in those 2 seconds something in her face rearranged itself into an expression that several witnesses later described, separately and without comparing notes, as the most frightening thing they saw that morning, more frightening, even, than what came after. "Do you have any idea what that was?" she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It was worse than loud, each word placed with the precision of someone who had spent a career learning exactly how much damage could be done without ever raising the volume. 11 days. $40,000 in press value walking through that door in 10 minutes, and your daughter just put her hands on something she had no business touching. She's 7, Elijah said. He kept one hand on Helen's shoulder, his voice level, and didn't move from where he was crouched beside her. She didn't mean to. I'll cover whatever it costs to remake it. But I need you to look at her and understand she's a child who made a mistake, not a problem you get to take this tone with. Grace's eyes moved from Helen to Elijah for the first time, taking in the small embroidered logo on the breast of his jacket, the logo of the specialty supplier that delivered her flour, her butter, her vanilla, 6 days a week, the same supplier she had personally negotiated a 3-year exclusive contract with 8 months earlier. You work for Callaway, she said. It wasn't a question. Something shifted behind her eyes, the particular calculation of a person realizing they were standing over someone whose livelihood ran, however distantly, through her own hands. Do you have any idea how easy it would be for me to make one phone call and have Callaway lose every account they have in this city? Do you understand what I could do to you before you even get home tonight? I understand you're upset, Elijah said. I'm asking you to be upset with me. Not with her. He rose to his feet, and so did Grace, and for the first time the room around them, 24 press, a dozen staff frozen near the kitchen pass, a publicist with her hand halfway to her mouth, became aware that this was no longer a small, containable thing. You people, Grace said, and stopped herself for half a second, as though some distant part of her recognized the sentence she was about to finish and chose, deliberately, to finish it anyway. Can't bring a child somewhere like this without something getting broken. I don't know what you expected. A man who delivers flour for a living, alone with a child this early in the morning. Maybe child services should know how unsupervised she really is. Helen's grip on her father's sleeve tightened. Elijah felt his daughter go still against his side in a way that had nothing to do with the cake and everything to do with the words alone and unsupervised, words a 7-year-old shouldn't have to learn the weight of on a Saturday morning in front of strangers. He did not raise his voice. I'm going to ask you one time, calmly, the way I'd want someone to ask me. Apologize to my daughter. You have no idea who you're talking to, Grace said. Her voice dropped, the way it did when she was no longer performing for the room but speaking from somewhere underneath the performance entirely. My father built this company from a folding table in a strip mall. I have spent 11 years proving I deserve to run it, and I am not going to stand here and be lectured about matters by a delivery driver in front of every camera that's going to decide whether this company survives its IPO. Then apologize for the cameras, Elijah said. Either way works. Something in Grace's face went very still, the stillness just before a structure gives way that no one watching could correctly name until afterward. She took one slow step forward, and the publicist beside her said her name once, quietly, the way people say names when they already know it's too late. Then her hand moved before anyone, including Grace herself, fully registered the decision to move it. The sound cut through the room like something breaking that couldn't be put back. 40 cameras that had been pointed at a ruined cake 30 seconds earlier were now pointed at a different kind of wreckage entirely, and at least 6 of them were already live. Elijah's head turned with the force of the blow and came back slowly, deliberately, with no anger in it that anyone could see, only a stillness that made several people in the room feel, without being able to explain why, that they had just watched something far more serious than an act of temper. Helen did not cry. She stood very still with both arms wrapped around her father's waist, watching his face the way a person watches a door, waiting to see which way it opens. David moved first. He had been standing near the kitchen pass since the cake came down, the senior pastry chef whose name appeared nowhere on the marquee outside but whose hands had built nearly every dessert on the menu, and his first instinct, the one his job required of him, was the same instinct that moved every staff member in that room toward containing the situation in front of 40 cameras. He crossed the floor at a near run, positioned himself a few feet from Elijah with the practiced authority of a man who had defused worse, and reached out a hand to ask the customer, calmly, to step back. His hand stopped in the air. Elijah's sleeve had ridden up during the confrontation, just enough to expose 3 pale, ropey lines of scar tissue running across the inside of his right wrist and forearm, a very specific pattern that David O had seen exactly once before in his life and had never once forgotten, because the last time he'd seen it, it had been actively bleeding. 15 years earlier, in a cramped basement kitchen in the 11th arrondissement of Paris, a 26-year-old commis named David had been 3 feet from a grease fire that erupted out of a fryer without warning, and the chef who pulled him backward by the collar of his jacket, shoved him through the service door, and then went back into the flames a second time to retrieve the burning towel that had caught on David's sleeve, at the cost of 3 deep lacerations across his own forearm. That never fully healed, had been a man the entire kitchen called simply Chef Carter, the American who'd arrived 2 years earlier with no formal training and had since rewritten half of what the kitchen thought it knew about pastry, before vanishing from the industry entirely a few years later for reasons no one in Paris ever fully learned. David had spent 15 years half expecting to see that scar again somewhere, in some kitchen, on some stage, accepting some award his old mentor had never once cared about. He had never once imagined he would see it on the forearm of a man who had just been slapped in the middle of his own employer's grand opening for the crime of asking for an apology on his daughter's behalf. "Chef Carter," David said. His voice came out smaller than he intended, almost a question, though there was no question in it at all. Elijah looked at him for the first time since the slap landed, and something in his face, not surprise exactly, more like the recognition of an old debt arriving at an inconvenient time, settled into something almost gentle. "It's just Elijah now, David," he said quietly. "Has been for a while." The room, which had gone silent after the slap, went silent again in an entirely different way. Grace's hand was still half raised, half forgotten in the air. "Ma'am," David said, turning to her, his voice no longer the careful, contained voice of an employee but something rawer underneath it. "Do you have any idea who you just hit? This man pulled me out of a fire with his bare hands. Every lamination technique your pastry program runs on, every croissant on that menu out there, exists because of a method he invented and never once tried to take credit for. He saved my life in a kitchen in Paris 15 years ago, and you just slapped him in front of his own daughter because a cake fell over." The first camera had gone live 9 minutes earlier, when the centerpiece came down, on the account of a food journalist who'd been planning to post a 30-second teaser of the unveiling and instead found herself holding a phone aimed at something considerably larger. By the time David finished explaining who Elijah Carter actually was, 4 other phones in the room were live as well, and the footage, the cake, the confrontation, the slap, and the unraveling of exactly who had been on the receiving end of it, was already moving through the internet with the particular, ungovernable speed of something that has stopped belonging to the people who filmed it. The first headline appeared within the hour: "Korean bakery CEO slaps delivery driver at grand opening. Turns out he's the legendary chef who built her menu." By evening it had been picked up by 4 major outlets. A culinary trade publication ran a piece tracing Elijah Carter's lamination method through 6 well-known pastry programs that had never credited him. A clip of David O's unscripted defense of his old mentor crossed 3 million views on its own by midnight. Elijah turned his phone off in the parking lot, the way he generally did with most things he had no intention of managing in real time, and drove Helen to the small park near their apartment, 40 minutes later than planned. The swings were still there. The park did not know or care what had happened that morning, and for 2 hours, neither, really, did Elijah, who had learned a long time ago how to set a thing down completely while he was with his daughter, even when the thing in question was considerably larger than usual. By Monday morning, the fallout had organized itself into the kind of orderly, accelerating sequence Grace had watched happen to other executives and never once imagined happening to her. The investment bank managing the IPO issued a brief statement pausing the roadshow pending review. 2 board members, both old allies of her father, called for her immediate leave of absence, citing brand risk language everyone in the room understood to mean something considerably more personal than brand risk. A culinary nonprofit that had spent 2 years quietly trying to track down the inventor of the lamination method Hanek Table's pastry program was built on finally succeeded, entirely by accident, and published a long piece crediting Elijah Carter publicly for the first time in over a decade, a piece that did more to define the week's news cycle than anything Grace's own publicist managed to put out. Her father called once, Monday evening, and said almost nothing for the first 30 seconds. Then he said, in the flat, controlled voice she had spent her whole life learning to read for warning signs, "I built this company so you would never have to claw for anything the way I did. I did not build it so you would become someone who slaps a man because his daughter touched a cake." Grace did not argue. She had watched the footage by then, more than once, the way people watch the exact moment they stopped recognizing themselves, and found she had nothing in her to argue with. Helen didn't bring up the cake again that day, or the next. Elijah had learned years earlier that she processed difficult things on a private schedule of her own design, usually arriving all at once, usually at night. It came on Sunday, after he'd turned off her lamp and was sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark, the way he did most nights before she fell asleep. "Daddy," she said, without opening her eyes, "why didn't you tell that lady you used to be famous?" He thought about the question longer than he needed to, the way he tried to think about all of her questions. "Because being right about who I am has never needed an audience to be true," he said eventually. "I know who I was in those kitchens. That didn't go anywhere just because nobody else remembers it. What I have now, you, Saturdays, cake day, that's not smaller than what I gave up. It's just quieter." Helen considered this with the particular seriousness she reserved for things she intended to keep. "Okay," she said finally, in the tone she used when something had been filed away for good. Elijah sat with her until her breathing slowed, and then he sat there a little longer, the scars on his forearm faintly visible in the low light from the hallway, 3 old lines that had cost him nothing he hadn't chosen to pay. Grace requested the meeting herself, 3 weeks after the morning that had ended her IPO timeline and very nearly her career. She came without a publicist, without her father, without an attorney present in the room itself, the one waited outside per advice she'd been given, and chosen, in the moment, to ignore. The meeting took place in the back office of the Eastlake location, the same building, because Grace had insisted on that specifically, against the advice of nearly everyone she'd asked. Elijah arrived alone. Helen was at school. "I've rehearsed this twice," Grace said, sitting across from him, "and both times it sounded like something written for cameras instead of for you. So I'm not going to use it." She paused. "I watched the footage more times than I should admit to. I told myself, for the first few viewings, that I'd been provoked, that the morning had been impossible before any of it happened, that the context mattered." She looked at him directly. "None of that is a defense for hitting you in front of your daughter. I know that. I knew it walking in here today." Elijah didn't answer immediately. He had spent 3 weeks deciding what, if anything, he owed this conversation, and had arrived at very little beyond simple presence. "I'm not interested in punishing you any further than what's already happening," he said. "But I want you to understand what actually scared me that morning. It wasn't the slap. It was watching my daughter learn, in real time, what it sounds like when someone decides a person doesn't matter enough to be careful with. That's the part one can't get back for her." Grace was quiet for a long moment. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry. Not because it's the appropriate thing to say in this room. Because it's true, and I don't have anything else worth saying instead." He looked at her for a while, then nodded once, the same unhurried nod David had given him 15 years earlier across a Parisian kitchen after the fire was finally out. An acknowledgement. Not an absolution. What Grace offered him, in the weeks that followed, was not money, although money was part of it. It was a formal, public, fully credited partnership. The lamination method half her pastry program ran on would carry his name in writing, in print, on the company's own training materials, with royalties backdated and continuing, structured however his attorney wanted it structured. Elijah turned down the part that came with cameras. He kept the part that came with a number large enough to mean Helen's college fund stopped being a thing he worried about at 4:40 in the morning. He also asked for one specific, smaller thing that surprised Grace more than the financial terms did: a single dessert on the menu, unglamorous, listed quietly, named for his wife. Maya's tart, it said on the printed menu the following spring, no further explanation offered to customers who asked, because some things didn't need an audience to be true either. He still drove deliveries 3 mornings a week. He liked the hours, and more than that, he liked the version of his life that had nothing left in it to prove to anyone. On a Saturday some months later, Helen sat at their kitchen table with a new coloring book, horses this time, not cakes, a private joke between them that had started somewhere in that strange autumn and simply stayed, and Elijah watched the morning light fall across her hands and the open page, the old scars on his forearm catching it too, the way they always did, 3 pale lines from a kitchen fire half a world and a lifetime away. He didn't think about Paris. He watched his daughter color a horse's mane the wrong shade of blue on purpose, and thought about nothing else at all. Every story leaves a mark. If this one meant something to you, pass it on to someone who needs its message today. Subscribe and join us for more stories that reveal the power of humanity, choices, and transformation.